briefly so we can get right into this, but thank you all for being here for this presentation by the candidate for our core faculty position. And just to give you a brief idea of who he is before he presents, Debashish Banerji, Dr. Debashish Banerji is the Hardhass Chaudhary Professor of Indian Philosophies and Cultures at CIIS. Prior to this, he was Dean of Academics and Professor of Indian Studies at the University of Philosophical Research in Los Angeles. Dr. Banerji's interests lie in cultural studies, yoga psychology, postmodern philosophy, and his book on the yoga psychology of Sri Aurobindo, 7 Quartets of Becoming, was granted the Danam Award for Constructive Philosophy in 2014. So please welcome him.
Let's not forget that he knows about hip jazz musicians too.
I missed that part.
So this talk is titled The Integrative Impulse, Synthesis of Traditions in the Earliest Formulation of Sri Aurobindo's Yoga Practice. So as you all know, Sri Aurobindo coined the term integral yoga, and he gave a formulation to the integral yoga that people are familiar with, which is carried in his books like The Life Divine and Synthesis of Yoga. And he's using a certain terminology or language there, which is more what one might call transpersonal, in the sense that he coins his own terms, he's giving his own definitions to these terms, and he peppers these texts with Sanskrit terms, which are related to the Indian tradition. But a lot of it is, I think, deliberately an attempt to make it more international. So what I'm going to talk about is the earlier version of the integral yoga, during which time he was engaging with the Indian traditions and actually couching his terminology according to these traditions. And so it's more like the ground level of the integral yoga. And I've written on this, not only in the book but elsewhere, where I don't see it as a full continuity. There's actually discontinuities between these versions. But this is to also posit that something like an integral impulse was at work in him. And is this idea of the integral impulse something that is specific to him, or is it general? Can one posit it in a general sense? What is integral? Integral, I see in terms of, as Sri Aurobindo discusses it, a complex unity, which involves finding a principle which organizes radical diversity. Where does the intuition of the integral arise from? And so I'm looking at it in 2 ways. One is we can talk about it ahistorically, and ahistorically, one is the most basic way of arriving at an intuition of the integral is ontological. We find ourselves in a world in which there is the presence of diversity, but it is configured through repetition and variation. So we see it's a natural intuition to think that there is some uniting principle, which becomes actually one of the guiding tenets of science itself. On the other hand, we can take an ontogenetic view through the philosophy of becoming, which is voiced by people like Bergson, Teilhard de Chardin, Sri Aurobindo himself, and more recently Gilbert Simondon. And that looks at it in a historical fashion, or rather at least a temporal fashion, that life begins by expressing diversity and variation, but gradually there is increased complexification and centration in species. Species come up that are more complex and that have a greater centration of this diversity in them. And at a certain point, there is a centration of consciousness, which is the emergence of personhood and individuation, and a drive towards the integration of complexity from that point of view. So that is an ontogenetic viewpoint. But that also remains sort of ahistorical, because we don't know where we stand in this process. So I'm going to also posit it historically and say that this is a modern phenomenon. And from that point of view, we see modernity as a post-enlightenment ontology. We are in a modern age, and that is determined by the 17th century European movement we call the Enlightenment, which is a systematic and methodical turn towards the acquisition of total knowledge of the cosmos and the individual. So that's the birth of the modern knowledge academy, which is in a sense where we are, the decentralized, epistemological institution that is involved in generating or producing knowledge that is additive. We are creating archives of knowledge aimed at answering these questions. What is the cosmos, and what is the who, and what is the what? And the second tenet of that is the use of this knowledge to create a perfect or at least better world through applied knowledge. So these, in a sense, are modern ideas. These ideas are kind of the world in which we find ourselves. However, these are not seen as a drive for an individual. They're not for individual acquisition or achievement, but the collective enterprise of all humanity. It is something that because human lives are considered to be constrained in time and space, so we stand on the shoulders of those who went before us, and we work with those who are around us to piece together knowledge. This is more like the knowledge academy idea. But also this may be seen in ontogenetic terms. In other words, we can see it, the knowledge academy itself as going through an age of specialization, but leading to an age of integration. And the 21st century globalization may be seen in epistemic terms of integration. In other words, we've spawned so much diversity, we are now bringing it together. And we are doing it through interdisciplinary means, cross-disciplinary means, also through engaged activities which are multidisciplinary, very, very large projects in which people from many disciplines come together, etc. So from that point of view, we can see that there is a need for individuals to interact with vast diversity and complexity. So this requires the building of internal structures and metagrammars for integrating diversity, or which we might call the integrative turn. I'd say it is much more contemporary in a sense. We are at the cusp of an age of needing this kind of integrative turn, but Sri Aurobindo was an early person who felt the integrative impulse. This is what I'm calling it. We can critique this idea of integration. A critique would be that total integration is impossible under human mental conditions. Firstly, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. An additive method cannot achieve integral wholeness. Secondly, infinite diversity cannot be mentally encompassed under unity. Something's always going to escape. And this is a very big problem. It's an epistemological problem which belongs to all universalisms. It's called the problem of the big, theory of everything, the TOE. And so we find that universal structural claims to integrality turn into fascisms. This is a major philosophical conundrum. However, we can again see the integrative turn as a process ontology. In other words, we are not really invested in getting everything, but in building structures that integrate complexity. It is an existential preparation through the identification of a productive dialectic forming a problematic field for expression of diversity and its psychological organization. In other words, can we arrive at a certain understanding of something which is a productive dialectic, and that generates diversity, okay? And there's a variety of these. This way of thinking is also something that we find in a number of the philosophers of becoming, including Gilles Deleuze, whose ideas are really problematic fields that are generating through ontogenesis. Sri Aurobindo comes into this he understands the critique of the fact that infinite diversity cannot be encompassed under unity. But what he's saying is that there is a vanishing point. It's not something that human beings can encompass at this point. But we may posit a form of consciousness which is non-human, non-mental, and yet not, completely non-mental. So that's what he calls the supermind. It's a vanishing point. We are not there. We don't know. We can't say what it is. So we can't say that integrality actually exists. It is something that one can work towards, but it is not within our reach at this point. But it is approached through consciousness centration and enlargement. And this is where it becomes general, which is, I think, the method he followed, which is an existential integrative hermeneutic praxis using texts, traditions, practices, intuitions, and experiences. So this is, we were talking about a practical component, and this is the practical component. In other words, in a sense, we are all involved in a journey in which we are dealing with complexity. And if there is the integrative turn, then we follow an internal hermeneutic, which in the modern time, we don't go necessarily to a guru, or we thread our way through a variety of different things, including texts that we are reading, practices that are arising, traditions that we come across. That may include going to a guru or whatever for a time or for a long time. And out of this arise intuitions and experiences that fuel the journey, as it were. Now, in Sri Aurobindo's case, what I'm positing is this is what he follows, and I'll show you a chart in which you see that. But before going there, I want to point to the productive dialectic. I'd like to say that he didn't have this dialectic to start with, that it was empirically arrived at through this hermeneutic. So through this process, he arrives at different kinds of experiences, and these experiences include large visions of this kind of ideas. And the productive dialectic crystallizes in terms of the two major Indian traditions of Vedanta and Tantra for him. And so these are connected with, I'd say, in a transpersonal way, to the will to liberation and the will to enjoyment. And in a sense, he's reducing the spiritual drive into these two drives. One is the will to transcendence, that we want to be free of every possible attachment or bounding limit. The other is, no, we don't want to be free, we want to enjoy life, or we want to enjoy our rounded, embodied existence. Mm-hmm. So these get assimilated in him to the traditional methods of Vedanta and Tantra, respectively. And these again rest on the dualistic school of Sankhya, where there is Purusha and Prakriti. Now for him, I will not go into that because later he reconciles it by saying this dualism of Purusha and Prakriti becomes a monism in a Vedantic sense, but he's looking at that monism as the vanishing point, which is not yet here. He doesn't believe in jumping to that without creating structures that are yet to come, so to say. So here is a little table of what these pan out into for him. Vedanta is gendered male and is related to Purusha. Tantra is gendered female and related to Prakriti. Vedanta is related to being, and Tantra to becoming and action, karma. Vedanta to Brahman. Vedanta proceeds through purification, Shuddhi, and Tantra proceeds through the embodiment of power, Shakti. Vedanta leads to liberation, Moksha, Mukti, Samatha, which is equality, Shanti, which is peace, and Tantra generates enjoyment, Bhukti and Ananda. And Vedanta also leads to knowledge by identity, Jnana or Vidya, while Tantra leads to paranormal powers and worldly success, Siddhi. and freedom from disease and physical immortality. Sharira, which is body, and Arogya, which is the freedom from disease. So this is the capsulation, the productive dialectic that emerges. And what I'm pointing here is when Sri Aurobindo returned to India from England in 1893, he went through 3 or 4 major location shifts. He was first in Baroda from 1893 to 1905. And during this phase, it was mainly engagement with texts. He was familiarizing himself with the Indian textual tradition. So he was reading the Upanishads and the Gita. He was translating the Upanishads and writing his commentaries. And he had some spontaneous, he wasn't practicing any of this as such, but he had a spontaneous experience of the Jivatman, as he identifies it later, which you see the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th column is the implication in terms of Sanskrit terminology that he gives to these things in his formulation, earliest formulation, which is called the Sapta Chatushta, that I have translated as 7 quartets. So this experience he constellates around Brahman. What he gets from the Gita, he constellates around karma or karma yoga, and samatha, equality, practices of these two. And then they also reduce to ultimately this dialectic of Vedanta and Tantra. So each one of them has got either a pointer to Vedanta or to Tantra. He has a spontaneous experience of Kali Darshan in Baroda. And he's not looking for it, but he has it. It's related to Shakti and to Tantra. He moves to Calcutta during the revolutionary period, from 1906 to 1907, and he continues his studies in the Gita and Upanishads, but they actually take on more practical dimensions at this point. He's actually using the Gita in revolutionary praxis, and he also is introduced to the Bengali regional tradition of Shakta Tantra. So that's where he actually writes a lot about that, and he writes his 2 major revolutionary texts, Hymn to Durga and Bhavani Mandir, which are couched in terms of Kali and Durga worship. Again, relating to Shakti and Tantra, while the Upanishads and the Gita are related to Brahman, Vedanta, Karma and Samatha, both Vedanta and Tantra. He moves then for a very brief period to Baroda again, where he meets a yogi called Vishnu Lele, and he has just 1 week, and he has his profound experience. This is initiation, and it's also part of a regional tradition, so it's a guru. And we're not really absolutely sure what kind of lineage Lele came from, but it was a Vaishnav lineage. And it's possible it's what is called Pancharatra Vaishnavism, because his terminology starts talking in terms of Pancharatra theory. I've theorized that in my book. He practices surrender, and he has a difficult time practicing surrender to a kind of a form, God with form, Narayana. But eventually he does that. I mean, his experience leads him there. But he also practices Raja Yoga under the leadership of Lele, and has the experience that he calls Nirvana. But it's really what the Gita calls Brahma Nirvana. It's more the Gita's idea of Nirvana, which is more like an experience of Brahman and constellates with Vedanta. And the Samarpan or surrender and listening to Narayana's Adesha, in other words, the leading, guiding of Narayana, it's really the same impulse that he was seeking, which he later constellates with what he calls the psychic being, and also with Socrates' daemon. That's the voice of the guide within. That's what he went to the guru seeking, in fact. That was what he went there for, and he got it. So after that, he listens to the guidance. And these are, again, related to karma, Vedanta, Tantra, Brahman related to Vedanta. He comes back to Calcutta, continues his work with the Gita, and he's thrown in jail for a year. And he has, again, two major experiences, which are initiation experiences, but these are disembodied initiation experiences, one from Krishna and one from Vivekananda. And they also lead him to similar experiences. The samadhi of Brahma, of karma samadhi, which is the Gita refers to as Brahma karma samadhi, and Krishna darshan, the darshan of Krishna, which are again related to Vedanta Tantra, and interestingly, he constellates the Krishna tradition with Tantra. And so Krishna and Kali become the two partners in his Ishvara, Ishwari idea. And finally, the Vivekananda thing is very interesting because it opens him up to new sources of knowledge, Vijnana and Siddhi, which again relate to Vedanta. And then he practices the Vedantic Mahavakyas. In other words, he's repeating these Mahavakyas. All this is only the Brahman, for example. Sarvam Khalvat Vidam Brahman. And as he practices them, he normalizes the state of mukti in his own experience. And again, he's also looking for Shakti there. And so it's not only Vedantic, but Tantric. So this is how he engages a praxis, which is an existential praxis that leads him ultimately to the reduction into Vedanta and Tantra. And then he receives from within architecture, one may say, that organizes it all, which is what you see over here. Now, this yantra is not how he puts it. One may say that's my organization of his process, but essentially those the little balls that you see around, are the kind of various ideas that we encounter, and they are split into two hemispheres, the half of Vedanta and the half of Tantra. And the idea of the productive dialectic is you have to engage all of them. One has to practice both the Vedantic practices leading to Brahma, Samatha, Shanti, and Vijnana, knowledge, and the Tantric practices leading to Shakti, physical body, Sharira, and action, karma. So that's how he configures it at that point. And I have one last slide which actually goes into the detail of, you see, he doesn't see these as completely split. They are involved in each other. So each one of these has got its own Vedantic and Tantric components to it. And so he divides each one of them, as you see. The larger section of Vedanta has Brahman, Samatha, and Vijnana. And within it you have Vedantic and Tantric strands. The central one is a Siddhi, which also has Vedantic and Tantric strands, two of each. The Tantric three are Karma, Shakti, and Sharira, which also are divided into these Vedantic and Tantric strands. So that's essentially the crystallization that he arrives at, and that is what the integrative impulse leads him to as the first level of his yoga. I think that's what I wanted to talk about, and I'll stop here and take questions or comments, etc. Yes,
Yeah, I think it might be good if you add something to this. It's not exactly a question specific, but maybe you can just comment on it. But of course, he rejected the idea of Maya in the sense of traditional Vedanta, and I think that it has a profound psychological implication. I mean, I'll say my version of it real simplistic, and that is that, you know, if you take the position of an absolute reality, which most of us don't have, by the way. I mean, if we're lucky enough to get
Sure.
to that point and kind of see the real delusion or illusion, whatever we call that.
Mhm.
But for most of us who don't really have that, and we're just thinking or talking about it, if we take that absolutist position and look down and say this is an illusion, then there's little interest in this world, you know, because matter becomes illusion and all of that. And I think he did something really to work with this. But if I have a question in there, is the world still is problematic, you know, it's like it's a real illusion or it's a real delusion. Like our
Right.
state of consciousness is still is problematic. It's not
Right.
like because it's real, it's also complete. So if you can say something around that, because I think this
Well,
is the difference.
Yeah,
of
there's an interesting aspect there, because if you look at it empirically in terms of his experiences, you know, when he went to Baroda, the experience he had of the Brahma Nirvana was not something he was expecting. And it was a profoundly disillusioning experience. He did experience the kind of unreality of the world. But the interesting thing is that, I mean, that's where this, what I'm calling the integrative impulse comes in, that he wasn't satisfied with it. So he actually goes on record as saying, a liberation that left the world as it is was felt by me to be distasteful. In other words, it was a matter of taste. He couldn't, it didn't satisfy his taste, you may say. So he persevered, and that's why he says when he was in the jail, new structures of experience started coming to him, which we can call maybe tantric, in which he saw the reality of the world. Because Tantra believes that the world is real, and the world is the body of the mother, right? So that kind of notion, but he related it to Vedanta. He calls it the passive Brahman and the active Brahman, what would be called the Shakti. So I think it's his own inner predilection that didn't allow him to stop there.
And maybe one more point on top of that. Do you think that it was because of his psychic inclination toward the feminine aspect of the soul embodied as his primary experience that he did not take the Jivatman path out? Because I think, you know, there may be that in this time of history, you know, the divine feminine comes in very strongly. It's no longer time to get up and wait. It's time to come in and do the work. And so that kind of soul-centeredness, as opposed to Jivatman, which is unevolving and transcendent beyond time and space, is kind of useless, basically, right? I mean, it is nice to know, you know, we got a
No,
foot there.
interestingly, the Jivatman experience for him actually was practical.
Was it?
Yeah, he has a poem about it also, where he says Jivatman can actually control things down here. You know, the Jivatman experience came to him in Baroda, where he was in a horse carriage that went berserk, and he suddenly found himself going out of the body and taking the stance, and he could see everything and felt a will actually putting things in place. So that's interesting. But I agree with what you're saying. I'd also put it differently. I'd say that he started off as a revolutionary. He wanted transformation of the worldly situation, and I think that was a predominating factor in his search.
I'm reminded of a story from the old King Arthur tales where Galahad goes on his quest and he finds the Holy Grail, and he becomes enraptured and he's lifted up into heaven, and the Grail disappears. And everybody who's left is like, and King Arthur's like, well, that did us a lot of good. But I had a question. In some of the mother's writing, in some of the mother's writing, she has that emphasis on embodiment and here and now, you know. And I was just curious to what extent you thought she influenced his attitudes about that.
Well, the attitude towards the perfection of the body and even quote-unquote physical immortality as a sort of a siddhi, you know, it's the siddha tradition in India. and some of the tantric traditions already exist in that direction. I think he got that already before the mother came. But the mother definitely had a very profound. I think the discontinuities in the later formulation and what we are seeing here arise from the mother's influence. I think the terminology of the psychic being, etc., bringing the psychic to the front and all that.
Philosophical.
They're probably, yeah, they belong to Western, you could call it Kabbalistic to some extent. I think it enters theosophy, but I think it has longer roots. Yeah.
I like the way that you pointed out that in his analysis of Vedanta and Tantra that there are elements of each within each other, and you distributed that here, and I was thinking that sounds like a Taoist kind of understanding, and I was very excited when I saw that Dr. Wu was now teaching cross-listed courses, and Dr. Wu is awesome, and I've always wanted to take courses with him. So if you're both professors in the same department, then you could connect on this, like I've never heard this before, that there's Vedanta within Tantra, that he sees that there are elements of each within each other. I've never heard that. It's like they were separate and he managed to, philosophically unite them, but to see that he sees the one within the other, it's like seeing the little white dot within the black, how it is.
It is.
So that would be, I think, in a Batesonian kind of way, showing the importance of relationship between systems, then we can begin to get a much larger integral view of the entire world philosophical trajectory.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Sounds very exciting to me.
It's interesting.
Yeah, earlier in the presentation you mentioned the historical view on enlightenment, so I assume that you use enlightenment in the sense of
The Western Enlightenment.
the Western Enlightenment. So could you touch on the sort of relationship between the Western Enlightenment and the more Eastern tradition of Enlightenment, and specifically related
I don't
to-
think there's anything called an Eastern tradition of Enlightenment.
Okay. That's
It's a
maybe my-
translation from the Western tradition. You use the word enlightenment.
Uh-huh.
Well, what is the enlightenment? That there is no Indian term that maps to enlightenment.
So could you refer to it in
There are
Eastern-
spiritual experiences,
Okay.
many kinds. There's no one kind that can just be called enlightenment as such. That's my take on it at least.
There's a great book by an angel called Enlightenment, East and West, and it tries to do that, but he's right, it's not a tradition, it's like the term is like, Western. But
The
that book-
term
that book-
actually becomes utilized to talk about Buddhism during the period of the kind of, sort of translations that are taking place. The Buddha's enlightenment, right? And maybe you could use it as a translation of the term Bodhi, Bodhi, which in itself you may say that if the Buddha achieved a certain kind of state of knowledge, gnosis. Even that is a problematic debate within Buddhism. What is nirvana? Is it a state of knowledge? Could it be connected with enlightenment? Enlightenment has rational sort of foundations, but if you relate it to the Greek tradition of the logos, okay, or gnosis, then you open up a chasm, because in the Indian tradition, I think that's what he's talking about when the Vivekananda experience occurs. And he's talking about these ranges of mind and of knowledge about the mind. But he has a very difficult time talking about it, and from the viewpoint of the Indian tradition, and ferreting it out in some terms that he gets from the Upanishads.
I think you're referring to the historical enlightenment in Western history, which was kind of a self-congratulatory, hyper-rational.
It's mind-oriented.
Yeah, which, as Freud pointed out, the First World War kind of destroyed. But yeah. It'd be interesting though to know what was happening in India at the same time. I'm sure it's been written about.
A quick note, this coming Sunday at the CIF, defending British India against Napoleon.
Yeah,
It's a doctoral thesis, Aditya Das.
great.
Come on up.
I was a little kind of surprised about the distinction between like Vedanta will to liberation and Tantra will to enjoyment. I wonder if you would speak more to that, because I mean Tantra of course has had many different aims, you know, from classical to through the centuries, and then Neo Tantra, you know. Like really, I mean, most Tantrikas would say that their goal is liberation, but they have a different method that is more, it's quicker and faster. I mean, that's what they say. And I wonder if
you're right.
This is your thing, or is Aurobindo?
Actually, the tantric sort of notion is mukti bhukti.
Yeah.
So it is both liberation and enjoyment.
Mhm.
And so it is in his case as well.
Yeah.
That's why each is involved in the other. So from that point of view, they are, conjoined.
Yes.
But tantric tradition is very wide. I mean, some people believe that Kapalikas became tantrics. Some people believe tantrics existed separately. And what are the goals of tantra also is up for grabs to some extent. So here, as far as he's concerned, it is both liberation and enjoyment. But it gravitates towards, so he says, pure true enjoyment is not possible without liberation. That becomes his tenet. So enjoyment becomes the pole that is more proper to tantra. So in that sense, that's it.
The sound of Vedantic is the sound of Tantric is
Another frame. Well, I have a question from a different angle. I was taken with your second slide on the integrative impulse and the hermeneutic praxis of working with text, intuition, practices and whatnot.
Yes.
I wonder if you could wax a little poetic here and how you would put in some kind of small group discussion, experiential learning to really grapple with this, but from a hermeneutic praxis point of view with your students in the classroom. Like, what would that look like?
So it would really have to do with kind of introspection and sensing how one leads, how one is led through life, trying to make sense of it, particularly in the modern world where we don't have authority figures, but we still want to make sense of things. And so it would involve people introspecting about what they do to actually, what are the various sources of such knowledge that they engage with, given the fact that somebody like Sri Aurobindo, would engage with these various sources. One might say. So that's an introspective practice that they could actually think about and write down and discuss. That would be.
Would you give them any prompts to get them going, given the breadth of the diversity that you were talking about?
See,
Would
I mean,
you
we
show
could
them a
also.
piece of art or read them a poem from Sri Aurobindo and then say go at it? What would you do to get them in that nub of inquiry together? Or would it be enough to just present the
I think I'd just
ideas?
present the idea,
Mhm.
because it becomes too determined if one
Yeah.
reads something specific. I also feel that it helps to think about our contemporary times as one which is inundated with knowledge, because particularly due to in the internet. And most people, I mean, it helps to think about how we navigate through the internet, Somebody who doesn't know what they're looking for, it just wastes their day, moving from link to link and getting seduced by whatever comes in front. But a person who has a focus has a much more directed way of engaging with the internet, and ultimately can gather a lot of very useful knowledge in making sense along the lines that they wish to, you know, if they have that inner direction. So it's it's going within, and that's where part of this experiential component would be actually going within, meditating, trying to go deep into oneself, and then reflect on what is of value and what is not of value, a qualitative scale in one's own engagement with these things.
That, I think, would present a template against which the students could respond without giving them too much direction.
Right.
Thank you.
And it does speak to what I think is becoming an overwhelming, well, a great problem for everybody, is the avalanche of information. It used to be like, as a scholar, your main effort was trying to find enough stuff, and now there's that, but you also have to be discerning and say, okay, now I have 57 references when I was thinking of 3, and how am I going to handle that? So that's a reality of modern, not just scholarship, but being alive in the world today. So I think that needs to be addressed.
Now, how would you engage difference, like Gerard showing the scholar in a way probably you resonate with, a lot of what he has to say about his integration, its value, the direction of his spirituality, integrative spirituality, What about if some students engaging this process with, or that you invite them, like they come to different conclusions, they come to different viewpoints, and the challenge, the canon, and the challenge, so, how would they respond to that?
Yeah, sure. I'm also, when I'm positing this integrative impulse and saying that it's actually much more relevant to our times, etc., I wouldn't like it to feel normative, that there's a pressure for you to feel that this is what you need to do. Because again, it's, people are at different stages of their own development. And so, as I'm saying that Sri Aurobindo himself awoke to this kind of thing at the turn of the last century, but many others didn't. And today, too, we may have other concerns. An individual is free to pursue the concerns they have. It may not be this integrative concern. So if somebody challenges it, ultimately they are their own best guide. There is no canon as such. It's not a norm.
Thanks.
It is true, though, that I remember, it was maybe a long time ago now, but there was some influence around the Institute at one point. Some people have said it or taught it, some of them are not here anymore, that Sri Aurobindo is an elitist, and all of a sudden that sort of caught fire, and started looking at this whole thing as like, and it was so amazing. I remember one student, Janice, we had the core courses and people tried to get out of that and so on. So one of the students came to me and said, can I just waive this thing? I was teaching that course, and I said, let's talk about this a little bit. And then he gave this whole perspective, and I just sat there for a little bit and I listened, and I said, these things you say about the Chaudhurys and Sri Aurobindo and Mother, it's just totally inaccurate. I know, the Chaudhurys, have you read this material, by the way? And turns out no. And I said, so, let's just work out a plan here. You go read these 2-3 simple books. And we, it was interesting. He didn't quite succumb to the original, from that position, but sort of came out, sort of humbled out a little bit and walked away with the, so it's kind of interesting that sometimes also there is not just necessarily a philosophical difference or an attitudinal thing. There's also like elements of energy that are anti-spiritual, or or somehow they catch fire for a second.
It does.
Or the scent of fundamentalism is very worrisome for many people here.
Yeah.
Exactly. During the ashram, I've been in the ashram in India and Auroville several times, and as you probably know, there is It's elements of strong fundamentalism within
Yeah.
the ashram of active censorship,
Sure.
They are building whatever window within one or religion, and the pictures and the devotion and the whole thing, so anyway, it's not a question, it's more like I totally get that you're holding this distance now,
Yeah.
in a very gentle way, and also I would say more aligned with the spirit for window so I really appreciate that.
No, I think it's a very dangerous thing, and that's why also I pointed to the fact that people who turn these into structures, as you said, canons, they unconsciously make it into a fascism. Essentially, it is a fascistic movement because you start positing something to be the whole, while the whole is really something you have to gravitate towards. And in fact, as far as he's concerned, those structures haven't yet even been built.
What is structures?
What the integral,
Oh, I see.
what he's calling integral consciousness or supermind. In a sense, we are still within the mental realm, and there is a way out, but that way out has to be negotiated by the individual, and it's a journey, essentially. You can't expect others to embrace it, necessarily. But you can expect others to, enlarge themselves, maybe, because that becomes a practical issue, the enlargement of the self, to be able to understand the world, to comprehend others. So that it becomes pragmatic and helpful to show people how to do that. But to expect them to believe a belief system and say that, this is what it is, that becomes problematic. And that's happening, unfortunately, a lot in the Sri Aurobindo movement nowadays.
Well, apropos to what you were just saying, I wonder if you could comment on the work of Ken Wilber.
I think the major difference between the work of Ken Wilber and Sri Aurobindo is that he's also trying to, firstly, he's trying to do it through the mind. He's trying to build these structures that are more inclusive. And also there is a privileging of the kind of more inclusive over the less inclusive, in a sense. While in Sri Aurobindo's case, there is the understanding that there is something out there which we still don't have. But there is also the notion that everything, just like Vedanta is within Tantra and Tantra is within Vedanta, Brahman is everywhere, at every level. It's not that one level is superior to another and needs to be experienced at every level, in a sense. But one actually, the integral is one in which there are gradations to the expression of Brahman. But there isn't a certain kind of a hierarchy in terms of, privileging one over the other.
No color coding. Huh?
Yeah, that's why as you were
Orange
talking
level,
earlier
purple.
about, physical intuition, mental intuition, etc. Each one of these, has its own full access to knowledge. It's a different modality of consciousness.
Mhm. I really like that explanation of it. That makes it very clear. Other questions? All right, well, thank you so much for your presentation.
Yes.